It's a pleasure to have you on the Strong Stoic. You have a book coming out November 11th, which you're here to talk about on the topic of Diogenes, titled "In Diogenes: The Rebellious Life and Revolutionary Philosophy of the Original Cynic." So Diogenes has a special role in Stoicism, as I'm sure we'll touch on. I think many people familiar with Stoicism today might have heard his name, but might not really know who he was or his impact. So I just want to kick it off. Who is Diogenes? Why did you decide to write a book about him?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on your show, Brandon. It's really fun getting to talk to you and getting to talk to your listeners. Diogenes, just to get like the super basics and start from there. He is born at the end of the 5th century before Common Era or before Christ, some people will say, in Sinope, which today is in Turkey, and it's on the coast of the Black Sea. And at the time, this place was sort of on the border of the spheres of influence of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Persians, right? So they're sort of continuously contesting territory, and Sinope is one of the places that's really sort of in the middle of that. So it changes hands in Diogenes's lifetime. So he's really sort of in between these two sort of political spheres of influence. So he grows up in Sinope, and then he makes his way to Athens. Why he leaves, this is a whole story, pretty interesting, but we can get into it later if we want to. But bottom line, he's kicked out of Sinope. He doesn't leave voluntarily. He has to leave. He's kicked out of his hometown, and he ends up in Athens. And there, he starts to live his life in sort of a very focused and a very sober and a very simple way. And at the same time, he is always open to enter into conversation with whoever rolls up and talks to him. So he has a philosophical outlook that is centered on independence, making up his own mind, and being self sufficient, providing for himself. And perhaps most importantly, being prepared for whatever life may throw at you, for whatever circumstances. And what that means for Diogenes is that he trains his body and his mind to be satisfied, to live well with the absolute bare minimum. Because his reasoning goes, if you have practiced this and if you've trained this, then if life throws you a curveball and you lose everything, you're going to be fine, right? Whereas maybe your friend or your neighbor who hasn't done that is going to really suffer from a stroke of bad luck like this. Now, this philosophical thinking, this sort of example that Diogenes set, was getting a lot of interest in his own lifetime, and Alexander the Third, king of Macedon, comes and talks to him. Diogenes talks with Plato on many occasions. So he's well known in his own time. Now, for the history of Stoicism, the most important thing that Diogenes does is that he meets Crates, and Crates is totally convinced by Diogenes's outlook on life and implements it in his own life by selling off his family fortune and going on to live much as Diogenes does. Now, Crates goes on to be the teacher of Zeno of Citium. Now, Zeno of Citium, as I imagine your listeners well know, is the founder of Stoicism. So Diogenes is the philosophical, the intellectual grandfather of the founder of Stoicism. We can definitely think of him that way. And there are many things in the Stoic outlook on life that come from Diogenes, that Diogenes taught Crates, that Crates taught Zeno, and that made its way into Stoic thinking that way.
Yeah, that was a great introductory to this very strange person, which we'll get into. I'm sure some of his peculiarities. But yeah, I've always thought of Diogenes in some sense as like the stress test of a lot of the Stoic philosophy principles, meaning you'll see like, the Stoics talk about externals being, not a good, that character is the only good, and that, you don't need all of this stuff to be happy. And Diogenes was kind of the person that stress tests that and said, yeah, this can work. Now that being said, not all Stoicism doesn't necessarily, say that everyone should be Diogenes, but I think Diogenes was kind of in many sense, like a stress test for a lot of these Stoic principles. So maybe could you dive into that aspect of it a little bit?
Yeah, I really like that turn of phrase. I think it is a very nice way of looking at Diogenes that works well. And um, sort of later on, when we're looking at the Roman Empire and we see sort of Stoics engaging with this legacy of Diogenes and Cynic thought, they actually sort of argue some of these points pretty head on, right? And one of the key points then is how to relate to wealth and how to relate to possessions. And there, Diogenes goes very, very far. We know that when he arrived in Athens, at first, people said, "Oh, we're going to look for a house for you. We can arrange this." And then that sort of takes a little while. It doesn't come through, and Diogenes is like, "Well, what do I need a house for? I can just live in the marketplace." And he actually finds this really large earthenware jar, and it's put on its side. He lives in that, right? And a lot of sort of the iconography of the pictures of Diogenes show him like framed by the opening of this jar, which sort of is such a powerful picture. So he chooses to be homeless. He says, "You know what? Actually, I don't think I really need a house," right? And he there's a story that I think is quite beautiful. He At a certain point sees a kid who is drinking some water from a stream, from a little river, with its hands, and then Diogenes says, "Huh, what do I need this cup for?" Right? Up until this point, he'd be going around with a little wallet with a cup in it, and he's like, "I don't need this cup. I can just drink with my hands too." And he throws the cup away. Right? So that's a very powerful illustration of him defining like so in sort of such a drastic way and showing in such a drastic way um what you really need and what you don't really need. And for Diogenes, is as long as you can feed yourself and not be stressed out about procuring that food, as long as you're fine sort of sleeping outside and you don't get cold, you don't get hot, right? This is the protection that he looks for, right? Now, one thing that I think is important to understand about Diogenes is that he then doesn't sort of go on to say, and this is the only way in which you can live every day for the rest of your life, right? For Diogenes, it's all about preparedness and knowing that you are capable of this. But there are also moments where he has some sweet cakes, right? And people will comment on this, and then Diogenes says, "Well, why wouldn't philosophers eat honey cakes, right?" Or there's a moment when he's at a bar drinking a glass of wine, and somebody comes over and criticizes him for this, and he says, "Well, if I go to the barber's, I get my hair cut too, right? I'm at the bar. Why wouldn't I drink a glass of wine?" So for Diogenes, these things are not absolutist or dogmatic or rigid in any way. The only thing that matters is that you have to have lived your life in this extremely sober way for long enough that you know that you can do it, right? And then if in your everyday life somebody offers you a glass of wine, there's no need to say no. You don't have to punish your body, right? Diogenes is not interested in punishing your body. He's interested in training your body, right? I think that's sort of a nice way of understanding it and of distinguishing it.
Yeah, and I love that you make that point because I think that's something that people modern people can really relate to is like going through. You don't necessarily need to like sell your home and be homeless forever, and but just to like implement some time where maybe you not drop your standards, but you drop your comforts a little bit. A great example of this is some families will go through like a month of no spending. So they'll just freeze their spending for perhaps they notice that they're starting to spend more money on takeout or whatever it might be. Another example I like is some people will take a weekend and go to a cabin. So you have to like hand wash your clothes, wash your dishes, and it's kind of a nice reset and so yes, there's the proving that you can actually do it and still, be a decently happy human being. Um, so yeah, I think like that particular point of yeah, maybe you can sprinkle in some of this, not necessarily just go full on Diogenes, but you can implement this in small ways that ultimately would prepare you for something that, if something were to happen where you did lose your house or electricity went down for a week, God forbid, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I think that sort of the what Diogenes really wants us to do is not to become him, right? Right, precisely because Diogenes doesn't want you to copy. He wants you to be inspired, and that inspiration means that you, in your own situation, in your own life, have to look around and see, okay, how am I living my life? What do people expect from me? What do I expect from myself? Like what are the sort of the rules? Like what's the system that I'm living in? And then ask, well, are these good rules? Are they necessary? Does the system work? Um, do sort of the things that I expect from myself, do they align with what others expect from me? And if they don't, you should move away from what others expect from you, because ultimately these are the kinds of things that Diogenes says that we should continuously question and test and challenge, right? So it's all about sort of not being sort of lulled to sleep by the status quo, right? But instead, being able to really ask yourself every day, "What am I doing? Why am I doing this?" Right? It's sort of as basic as that.
Yeah, I think he was certainly he put a lot of thought into that the social expectations and what we might call today as like peer pressure, right?
Mhm.
So, and I think that's something that's part of the human experience because we are in groups and we go to school and we go through teenage years, and I think like what would you say the benefit of that particular thing is like stripping away that cultural stuff because there is the argument that I'm a Canadian, so in the Canadian culture, we have certain practices and standards, such as holding the door for people when you go into the mall or something like that. And that might be a nice thing, but I guess like the devil's advocate might say, why should we even think about that if you're in a culture and you're just kind of engaging in it? Like what benefit is there to stripping away that those cultural expectations?
Yeah, I really like this. I really like this question, and the way I the way I interpret Diogenes's thought here, and this is also where in antiquity philosophers who sort of picked up Diogenes's thought went, is that when these issues become interesting for Diogenes, when the holding the door open becomes too important in a way, right? Like at the moment where people start to care more about whether or not somebody is holding the door open than about whether or not this person is a good person and is a just person, right? That's sort of the moment where these cultural norms are taking on too much weight, right? And they are sort of obscuring our understanding of what it means to be a human being, and sort of what's important as a human being, right? So, and I think this is a very so I really like your example for this reason, because it shows so clearly that um Diogenes we like it's it makes a lot of sense to sort of wonder, right? Like, would Diogenes hold the door or not? And if we sort of take him seriously, does this mean that we're gonna sort of live in a free for all where everybody is sort of like moving away from these little kindnesses and we're sort of just moving through the world like brutes, right? In a way. And I think that Diogenes would definitely not be beyond not holding the door open and like sort of letting the door drop in your face, especially if he thinks that you deserve that, or if he thinks that you need to be taught a lesson about this particular topic. It's definitely something that he wouldn't shy away from doing. But he's ultimately much more interested in the bigger questions, and the reason why he would not hold the door was in order to show us that we've become too obsessed with this veneer of living together, with this veneer of society, and that we've sort of lost sight of these more fundamental questions about being a just person and sort of living in the world as a good person, right? And sort of like using your time on earth in a way that that sort of aligns with human nature and what it means to be human. And what Diogenes says is that holding the door can be a part of it, but it's not a it's not a necessary part of it, and it's certainly not a more necessary part than thinking about what it means to be a good person.
Yeah, I love the way you describe that, and I think about, if we can elaborate on that example just a little bit more. One of the things, like if you have, say, a foreigner come into Canada and they've never been to Canada and they don't know that custom, to the locals, they might actually appear to be ignorant or rude.
Mhm.
But in their mind, I mean, you could talk to them and they could be the nicest, kindest person that you've ever spoken to. And so it's kind of interesting how when you're engaged in a culture and you kind of have tunnel vision on that, you
Mhm.
do you do get that sense of connection and community, and you kind of intuitively think that this person's holding the door, therefore he knows the Canadian customs, therefore he's a good person, and then which might not, like you pointed out, might be true, it might not be,
Right,
and then
yeah.
you get a different culture just with a for whatever reason that's something that they don't do, and then in a sense, it makes your in-group connections maybe more strong, but maybe not in a true way because you're not seeing things clearly. And then I think in some ways, if you don't understand the cultural layers, uh, the human connection as a whole with other groups, other countries, and so on can kind of gap.
Mhm.
Um, and I would assume that Diogenes would have interacted with quite a bit of different, like you mentioned, just based on his location. Like he would have interacted with a lot of different ideas, a lot of different people, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely, and I really like that you're sort of bringing up the topic of cultural difference and sort of, um, like, the role that that plays, because for Diogenes, it's really important for him that he understands himself as as a citizen of the cosmos, right? As a citizen of the universe. And it's actually sort of in our text about Diogenes that we for the very first time find this word, right? Today in English we still say cosmopolitan. This is from a Greek word cosmopolites, and the very first time that we find that in world literature is when Diogenes says, I am a cosmopolites. Now, what he means by that is that he does not identify with any particular culture, with any particular city, with any particular set of norms, precisely because he feels all of these norms are different in all of these different places, but we are all human beings. So that shows that as human beings, it is not absolutely necessary that we live by any of these particular sets of norms, right? Because otherwise we wouldn't be having all of these different ones. And I do think that that is connected to his own experience, right? Where he grows up in Sinope, which is really a center of trade. So lots of different people passing through from the east, from the north on on sort of routes further west. Um, and then he is uprooted. He is kicked out of his hometown and goes to Athens, where um, in some ways he sort of there's things that are familiar, right? He already speaks the language, probably a slightly different dialect, but right, he would be able to understand what people were saying when he gets there. Um, but at the same time, he's also very much a foreigner. He doesn't have citizenship, right? So he cannot participate in the political system there in Athens or in Corinth, which is where he ends up later. And he continues to conceive of himself as an outsider for the rest of his life, and sort of um the only community that he identifies with is this notion of sort of a cosmos inhabited by human beings, but also by animals, right? He feels a lot of kinship with animals, and he looks at um, how sort of mice move through the world, and he thinks, oh, you know what, I can maybe also just sort of get my food together in this way and not worry about it, right? He sort of sees a mouse going through the world, and he admires how not worried the mouse is about getting their food or having a place to sleep, right? So he takes a lesson from that, and famously, he gets the nickname of the dog. He's called a dog by Plato, which Plato very much meant as an insult, and Diogenes takes it on and wears it as a badge of honor, because to him there's nothing shameful about being called a dog, because he thinks dogs have it figured out pretty well, right? They go about their lives just fine, and we don't need to look down on them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really cool yeah, being called a dog and just owning it and wearing it as armor.
Mhm.
Uh, wh- I know there's always debate, or at least there was back then, on his saneness.
Yeah.
Do we have any idea on whether or not he might have been a little crazy, or what do we know in that regard, or was he just because admittedly he's a bit eccentric, even
Mhm.
by Stoic
Mhm.
standards, which
Mhm.
Stoicism is also a little eccentric. So what do we know about that part of him?
Yeah, so this is another one of Plato's nicknames for him, right? So Plato gives Diogenes two nicknames. The most famous one is the dog, but he also calls Diogenes a raving Socrates at a certain point, right? So monomenos is the Greek word that he uses. And this from Plato's point of view is sort of it's a mixed message, because he is acknowledging the fact that both Plato and Diogenes are connected to Socrates. Plato himself was Socrates' student, but Diogenes is connected to Socrates because Diogenes was influenced by a man named Antisthenes, and Antisthenes was a student of Socrates. And in general, it is clear that when it comes to some of the sort of most important things that Socrates was famous for, namely not being interested in accumulating a lot of wealth, and devoting his life to philosophy, right, in this sort of very focused 24/7 way. These are things that Diogenes inherits, and that he may be inheriting better or more truthfully than Plato is, right? So this is so there's a little bit of a tension in when Plato says Diogenes is a raving Socrates, right? Now to get to the raving part, Plato thinks that Diogenes is raving is mad, because he is going much too far with his philosophical ideas, and precisely because he is defying all of the norms of the place where he lives, because he is rejecting the polis, he is rejecting the system of education as it existed at the time. So he is throwing out all of these things that Plato found really, really important. So sort of by the standards of life in Athens and in Corinth in the 4th century BCE, what Diogenes is doing is crazy, right? Because he is rejecting everything that people hold dear at the time. He refuses to get married, he refuses to have children, and then there are some of the obscene behaviors that he engages in that he's very famous for. He relieves himself in public, he pleasures himself in public, and these are things understandably were shocking, right? At the end of the day, I don't think that Diogenes was crazy in the sense that he didn't know what he was doing, right? I think that Diogenes was intentional and that he was doing those things for a reason. And when it comes to doing these shameful things in public, what he is doing is precisely as we were just talking about with opening the door, right? What he is trying to show is the sort of the ways in which these rules are arbitrary and not entirely necessary, right? You may find it disgusting that he does these things, but nobody died. The world hasn't stopped spinning, right? We are still fine as a human species. This is part of what he's trying to point out. He's also trying to point out that he cannot be shamed, that he is shameless, right? And he does sort of these most extreme activities to show that there is sort of there's literally nothing that you can sort of like say about him that would bother him in any way, right? So doing these acts that by Plato and by most other people at the time were considered incredibly shameful, he does them to show that he cannot be shamed, which then allows him to be completely independent, right? Because he can't be um, bribed, he can't suffer from a smear campaign because he will just take it all in stride, right? So this is an example where these are acts that might seem like they are the acts of a madman, but I don't think they are. I think they there's intention behind it and there's meaning behind it. And um you can say that Diogenes is a madman because he refused to accept the framework of thinking and living and acting that everybody around him accepted, right? And thought was the only way to be, right? So in that way, he is mad, right? But I think that that is a productive madness and sort of the kind of madness that inspired other people and that they were able to learn from.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question to that, but I guess just an example that came to mind when you were describing that is I see particularly with young people, they're moving away from drinking alcohol, which is really cool as a society. I'm not completely dry. I socially every now and then for me personally, but I do notice that there's this fear of going out to a social event and you being the only one not drinking.
Mhm.
And I think me along with a lot of people have that. And what's so interesting about that is if you've ever committed to just saying I'm not drinking, like I'm not going to have a drink tonight or whatever. This is just an example, but you build it up in your head on how catastrophic it's going to be and you're going to be made fun of and this is going to happen. And normally that's just not how it goes, right? So like Diogenes, he's doing these crazy things and that, at least appear crazy from the outside in. But
Yeah.
to your point, life kind of goes on and
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
as bad as you think it'll be in your head. Even something like you're talking about there, those examples. So I guess the follow up question is, he clearly did not care or did not want to care about needing to be understood. And I
Mhm.
think as human beings, we do have that inherent need to like explain ourselves and feel like we're being understood. But do you think like cynicism, I suppose, or what Diogenes, like what would he say to that particular struggle? And do you
Mhm.
think like he had struggles there, or do you think he was just kind of one of these people that just didn't care? Because there are people that genuinely don't care what people think or about being understood in what way. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think I love your examples. I think it's so incredibly hard to be a teenager and I remember that time very well. I will say there were many moments where I was not at all like Diogenes, and I was spending countless hours worrying about how people perceive me. But then there were also moments that, in a way, betrayed already my later interest, like when I shaved my head when I was 16 years old. In a way, maybe just to prove that that I was fine and I didn't care, right? So it was a little bit of a mix for me personally. I think that um, Diogenes, like there's a tension, right, in the sense that he does not care. He really does not care about being liked. He really does not care about being admired, but he does care somewhat about being understood, right? Like I do think that sort of precisely the way in which he was always talking to people, always answering questions, always sort of being in public, allowing himself to be seen by people, does come down to the fact that he had something to say. He had a message, and he thought that this was valuable, right? So, and this is an inconsistency in Diogenes' thinking, because he thinks of himself as being completely independent, and this is such an important part of his philosophy, that he doesn't need anyone or anything to thrive as a human being. But at the same time, as Diogenes, as a philosopher who has certain ideas about how to best live your life, he needed an audience. He needed people to be there to see him, right? And this is the performative aspect of his philosophy. So he it is in that sense that he does need to be understood somehow. He needs for people to be watching, because otherwise nothing comes of it. But he shows time and again that he is sort of sharing his message on his own terms. So he's not negotiating about like how to carry on this philosophical debate. He is showing it on his own terms in sort of a take it or leave it way. And I think that he must have that I think that he genuinely did not care about whether or not people liked him or admired him, but that he did want to share this thinking. And I think it is sort of on this level that he did connect with people, right? And a lot of time he was very funny, right? So he gives you his piece of his mind with a joke in a funny way, and humor is a way that we connect with others. So in that sense, I think there were connections. But when it comes to sort of long lasting friendships or even love, he is very negative about this, right? And I would say that's sort of where I think he throws the baby out with the bathwater a little bit, like sort of the way that I look at human thriving. I don't think that romantic relationships are a precondition for human thriving, but I do think that they really enrich human thriving. And I feel that sort of the calculation that Diogenes makes is, well, falling in love or being super attached to a friend makes you vulnerable, because they can change their mind, they can die, they can run away, right? And this is why he chooses to live this very solitary life. And I personally think that that is sort of a that is impoverishing, right? And that so then I think it is better to take this risk, right? I completely understand trying to separate yourself from expectations around status, wealth, sort of withdrawing from certain aspects of political life. These are things where I'm entirely with Diogenes. But when it comes to sort of cutting out personal attachments because of the way in which it makes you vulnerable, that for me goes too far, because I think sort of what you're missing out on is so great that it justifies the vulnerability that comes from connecting to other people.
Yeah, and you could maybe make the argument that if you're a cosmopolitan, as he claims, he might be of that mindset where he does get that human connection through just his general conversations with a random person. And I think it's a pretty small percentage of people that can live that way, but you do meet people sometimes that are true loners that don't have human, like close friendships. And again, I don't think that's the majority. I agree with you that most people should have, close friends and maybe a romantic relationship. You know, overwhelmingly, I think people show that. But I do know that, if you do have that kind of cosmopolitan mindset, he would probably look at someone that he's talking with on the street that he just met in the same ways, someone else might look at a friend. And there's something to be said, even though that's most people can't relate to that. There is something to be said about that, right? That's interesting.
Yeah. Oh, I agree with you so much. I really love the way you're putting that, because I think that and this is precisely the point for Diogenes, is that he's saying that as a human being, as part of humans thriving, these relationships are not absolutely necessary, and this is not true for absolutely everyone. And this is true, right? And I completely agree with you on that, right? And I do think sort of the idea of him um getting this sort of this kinship with the world as a whole through all of these really small interactions, that rings really true to me. Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. There, you probably most of us know a person who is a little bit like that, and who sort of um is very much a wonderful human being, right? But sort of exists in that way. Yeah.
Now, let me ask you, there's a topic I wanted to touch on here in terms of the externals, because obviously he tried to strip away absolutely everything. And then you will see the Stoics accept and try and really hold it in their heart that you don't need externals, but they don't necessarily say that you should completely avoid them. I mean, you look at Seneca, like he's obviously, because there is a difference between Stoicism and Cynicism,
Yeah.
but how I think overwhelmingly people do move forward towards things. People want to accomplish things. People have these desires, and it is useful to keep them in check. But I don't know. How do you think that through for the average person? Because there's a quote from Epictetus that haunts me every time I read it. But it's something like, if you can make internal progress and external progress at the same time, show me how. Like, he's kind of sassy about it, right? He's like, show me how you can get wealthy and maintain being a good person. And it is a really solid question, which seems, that quote in my mind seems more aligned with cynicism than it would stoicism. But I do agree that it can be difficult to both chase externals and internals. I mean, you only have so much time, and in some way they're contradictory. So, like, what do you make of that? What do you think? Like, is there a balance there? Is it maybe we should practice what Diogenes is at least thinking more, or how do you think about that for the average person?
Yeah. So I think for Diogenes, the distinction between internals and externals is not as sort of clear cut, or sort of as thought out as it would become for the Stoics. There's just a very limited amount of externals that Diogenes thinks that we should care about, right? But for Diogenes, the notion that you are going to expend some effort to feed yourself, and that you are going to be happy when you are able to feed yourself and unhappy when you are not, um this kind of thing for Diogenes is very acceptable, right? So the distinction there is not quite as stark as Epictetus would have it. But then at the same time, Diogenes would absolutely agree with Epictetus that um, as soon as you get wrapped up in achieving externals beyond that very basic level, right, you inevitably are going to suffer internally, psychologically, in the sense that you are going to become invested, and you're going to get dependent, and that's where Diogenes would absolutely agree with Epictetus. Now I think in our um in our own lives, what I've found, sort of the way in which I've found myself to have been most impacted by Diogenes, and what I found the most valuable, has to do with mostly with how you make certain choices, right? And that you sort of have like a sense of the things that are truly important to you. So when I'm presented with a choice, right, I do actually like ask myself like why am I doing this? Like if I say yes to this, I am I saying yes to this because I think it will create some good in the world? Am I saying yes to this because I think I will get some enjoyment out of it? Or am I saying yes to this mostly because I'm going to get a bigger paycheck at the end of the day? Or am I saying yes to this because I'm going to get attention from it and my status is going to be lifted, right? And this is sort of where I think Diogenes can be really, really helpful because um he sort of for me, he lets me see more clearly about myself, right? Which motivation is the stronger one, right? And if I sort of really break it down for myself where I'm like, well, do I think that that is like that is good in some way? Um, and when it turns out that the money factor was really what was going on, then I'm glad to have said no, right? Because I know that if I'd said yes for the money, right, the money is going to go, is going to be gone, but I'm still having to do the thing. And then when I do the thing, and it makes me feel dirty or stupid or then then there would have been then it's clear too late that it was the wrong choice. So then I feel like sort of Diogenes's way of looking at things has helped me make a choice. So this is how I would put it, like I I do live in a house and I do hold down a job, and there are, certain many compromises that I do make in my everyday life. But when it comes sort of to making a decision on a course of action in sort of like a very concrete moment, I do try to make those distinctions between basically just asking, why am I doing this, and trying to strip away what other people would think of it, trying to strip away what a certain consequence might be, but just really focus on the choice itself and these factors. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's some great closing advice. Minding your intentions, which is something the Stoics talk a lot about too, but quite a challenging thing to do, because you trick yourself a lot, right? If you get this big promotion opportunity and you in the back of your head, you're like, yeah, I'm doing it because, this and that. But really, yeah, it's $20,000 extra a year, So, yeah, that's really cool. I love that advice. Just closing things off here, I want to give you an opportunity to promote your book. Thanks for coming on, by the way. It was an absolute great conversation. And I certainly look forward to reading it. When this episode comes out, the book will be out. So we're recording
Mhm.
this. What is this? The 6th of November. So another 5 days, your book comes out.
Mm.
Where can people go to get the book? Where can people reach you?
Yeah. So the book will be available on November 11th everywhere books are sold. And you can buy it as sort of this wonderful hard copy, have it in your midst, just like this. But if you prefer to read an ebook, that's of course also an option. And audiobook will also be released on November 11th if you like to listen to your books. Um, and you can I always love it when people go to their local bookstores and support them. So even if it's not on the shelf, like ask them to order it for you and support them in that way. And I also have a few events coming up. I really don't know where your listeners are, but I have two events coming up. One in New York City on November 20th. That's a Thursday night at a amazing local bookstore called Tapas 2 in Queens. And then on November 22nd, I have an event here in Charlottesville where I live at New Dominion Bookshop, which will be on November 22nd. So these are opportunities to catch me live, and I really hope that you enjoy reading my book. If you want to get in touch with me, you can just go to my website. That is pretty simple, www.ingerkun.com, just my name. And if you send me a message there, it comes straight into my inbox. And I always love to hear from listeners, readers, and I would love to hear your questions about Diogenes or any thoughts that you have if you end up reading the book. I really like hearing from people always.
Absolutely, and I'll be sure to put the links in the show notes so people can check it out. Yeah, most of my listeners are American. It's podcasting
Okay.
is heavily an American thing, so
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
try and limit my Canadian accent, which is hard sometimes. But thanks again for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure, and yeah, I hope everything goes well with your book. I'm excited.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking with you, and thank you so much for having me.
Oh, no, I
No, I
appreciate
really
that.
enjoyed this so much, and I really also love how you're sort of translating these ideas as they are on the page to,
Hmm.
to listeners' everyday lives, because that's ultimately what it's about for me. So I love talking about that. So I yeah.
I've actually learned quite a bit on Diogenes as well, and yeah, you sparked an interest. I'm gonna have to dig into him a little bit more, which I'll do through your book. So,
Yeah.
again, thank you.
Awesome.
It was a pleasure. Until next time.
All right, until next time.
All
Have a
right,
great day.
you
Bye.
too. Cheers. Bye.